Good evening, everybody. I think we've got an audience today from around the world, actually. So welcome to this Council for British Archaeology, Festival of Archaeology online lecture by myself. I'm Dr. Simon Elliott. I'm an archaeologist, a historian, I'm a broadcaster and an author. And if any of you can hear any heavy breathing or contented sighing in the background, it's actually my golden doodle, Hector, the archaeological dog. And if he's in a good mood later on, I'll ask him to say hello to you, because he goes with me when I'm doing all my archaeological investigations. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about my first book, which my third book, which I had published a couple of years ago, which is called Septimius Severus in Scotland, the Northern Campaigns of the First Hammer of the Scots. This is Septimius Severus, the great warrior emperor, who for the last few years of his life tried to conquer Scotland and failed and died in York in AD 211. So the talk tonight is going to be about this incredible campaign that he launched to try and conquer Scotland. The last time the Romans really went for it, trying to conquer Scotland. And it's notable for two things. One, this is the largest ever campaigning force on British soil ever. Of 57,000 men, and secondly, we now know that in the second campaign in AD 210, he declared a genocide against the native Scots, well, the natives of the northern Britons who were living there. So there are a number of themes which will run through this presentation. So here you can see the great man himself with his distinctive beard. And moving on to the next slide, the presentation today. Just waiting for the next slide. There we go. The presentation today will be as follows. This is a deck which I use in my public presentations. I've given it around the country and to a wide variety of audiences, and it's mostly pictures. So most of my presentations like this are me talking to pictures. And you can see here the flow of today's presentation. But first, the pictures. So therefore, there you can see the upside down column from the Basilica of the Principia in the legionary fortress in York, which actually dates to the Severn Campaigns, because when he was in York, he turned it into his imperial capital and he enlarged the basilica, and that's one of the columns from his basilica. And secondly, here we can see a sort of a stylized image of combat between the northern Britons and the Romans. This is a much earlier campaign. This is Agricola in the late 1st century AD trying to conquer Scotland as well, and he also ultimately failed. So there's a lesson there for the Romans, I think, which they failed to heed by the time of Severus. So the flow of the presentation tonight is as follows. I'm going to very briefly just touch on who Septimius Severus is, just to give people a flavour if they're not familiar with this great warrior emperor. And then I'm going to talk about the sources that I use in my research and why we can tell the story now in a way we couldn't have told it a while ago. And then I'll give you a proper short biography of Septimius Severus. And then I'll talk about Severn Rome, because many places in Rome, notably the Forum Romanum, actually many of the buildings date to the Severn period. Not many people know this. And then I'll talk about the Severn military, because Severus was the first of the great reforming, military leaders of the Roman Principate, who tried to reform the legions in a way which began to change their nature forever. And then finally, I'll talk about the Expeditio Felissima Britannica, which is the way that the contemporary audiences styled these campaigns of Septimius Severus. And in that, I'll talk about the timetable of these two campaigns, which date from AD 207 to AD 211. And then I'll talk about the force that he used. And then I'll talk about logistics, and then I'll talk about the strategy that he used. It's a very brutal strategy, as we'll see. It's a very brutal campaign on both sides, notably intense guerrilla warfare with huge casualties in terrible campaigning conditions, because the weather was worse than normal in the campaigning period in both the years when the campaigns took place in 209 and 210. Then I'll go into detail about the campaigns, and finally I'll talk about Septimius Severus's legacy in the far north of Britain. What did he achieve with this incredible attempt to conquer the far north of Britain? So I'm going to turn the page now. And then I'll give you a bit of background about Septimius Severus himself. So this is a snapshot. Remember, this is not the full biography, it's a snapshot. So he's born in April AD 145 in Leptis Magna in Tripolitania. So this is in North Africa. And this is the richest city in North Africa. He's born into the richest family in the intense heat of a spring in North Africa. And then you jump down 3 bullets and you get to the fact that he died in the freezing cold of a British winter in York in February 8211. So this is an incredible story, in actual fact. He was the emperor from AD 193 to AD 211, campaigned in Britain from AD 208 to AD 211. Crucially, he was the founder of the Severn dynasty, which is the last dynasty of the Principate Roman Empire, which ended with the assassination of Alexander Severus in AD 235. And this is a crucial event because it ushers in the crisis of the 3rd century, which changes the very nature of the Roman Empire. And when Diocletian drags the empire kicking and screaming from the crisis with his accession in AD 284, it becomes the dominate empire, and it's very different. So the Severn dynasty actually ushers in a period which changes the nature of the empire. And we can talk when we discuss his legacy whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. And we'll move on to the next slide. So why are the sources, who are the sources, and why can we talk about the Severn campaigns now? Well, the 3 key sources are Classis Dio, who was a contemporary who knew Severus. He's quite critical of Severus. Herodian as well, who wrote shortly afterwards. Now Herodian, obviously with all of these ancient sources, they come with a sort of a health warning, but Herodian in particular in this case, and also the anonymous Historia Augusta. So they're the 3 key sources. Then we have some later Latin chroniclers, and then we have some fabulous modern sources as well, which we can refer to. So notably, one of my heroes, Anthony Burley, who wrote a great biography of Severus, and also a detailed analysis of the Roman government of Britain, which includes some incredible detail about the Severn campaigns as well. Shepherd Freer, the great David Breeze, Lawrence Keppy, and Anthony Camp. Notably recently, Rebecca Jones has done some amazing work, which is great for my research because a lot of it's about the marching camps. And as we go down to the last bullet, the marching camps in the Severn campaigns are very important because the identification of these marching camps as being Severn has enabled people like me to join the dots to look at the strategy that the Romans and the Severus used when they tried to conquer Scotland. And also in terms of the archaeology, because this is archaeology, this is the new stuff. We've been able to look at some of the themes of the Severn campaigns for the first time. And one notable one is a major depopulation event in the lowlands of Scotland after the Severn campaigns, which links in with this idea that he declared some kind of genocide in the 2nd campaign. So to that point, let's jump straight to it. So what I want to do is I want to give a flavour of, moving on to the next slide, I want to give a flavour of the nature of these campaigns. So often when historians and archaeologists talk about campaigns, they can come across being quite emotional, but there's an emotional quality to this presentation because of the brutal nature of the conflicts, and especially this idea that the Romans declared some kind of genocide in the 2nd campaign in AD 210. And I'm just going to take this slide out of context of the deck because I go back to this event in the narrative of the campaigns, but I want to address it right now first up. So at the end of the AD 209 campaign, which we'll discuss later, the natives in the far north of Britain, who I will detail in a minute, rebel again, and the Romans don't take well to recalcitrant natives rebelling against them, and they often act brutally. But it seems in this campaign the Romans were brutal against an entire people, not just a tribe or confederation. So here is the quote which Cassius Dio puts in the mouth of Severus when he's addressing the massed troops. Remember, this is 50,000 men, and it's a great typo there as well, the massed troops in York in early AD 210, before the 2nd campaign. And what he's doing is he's putting in the mouth of Severus the words of Agamemnon to his brother Menelaus from the Iliad. When Menelaus goes to Agamemnon and says, "I've got some captives, what should I do with them?" And this is what Agamemnon says to Menelaus. Remember, this is what Dio is inferring Severus is ordering his troops to do. "No, we are not going to leave a single one of them alive, down to the babies in their mother's wombs. Not even they must live. The whole people must be wiped out of existence, with none to shed a tear for them, leaving no trace." So that gives a flavour of the nature of the crescendo of the Severn campaigns in Scotland, which in my opinion does lead to this depopulation. But I'll address all of that in the context of the narrative later. So let's move on to the next slide. So now I'm going to look at Roman Britain in the 2nd century AD. So this is a thread building up to the Severn campaigns. Those of you who know me, many of you will have heard me speak before, know that I believe Britain in the Roman Empire was the Wild West. It's where as a young senator, you would go to earn your spurs in the military, which could always guarantee a fight either in Britain in the far north, which is never conquered, or against the Parthians, later Sassanid Persians in the east. Now, in the province of Roman Britain and later provinces, there is a clear divide between the south and the east, which is a full fat functioning part of the Roman Empire. All the wealth goes into the imperial fiscus treasury. And then the north and the west, which is still part of the province, later provinces, later dioceses, but because of an exponentially large military presence, is that the entire local economy is bent towards maintaining the Roman military. So the feel of the north and the west is always very different. And that is because the Romans, despite trying twice, in particular under Agricola and Severus, never actually conquered the far north of Britain. Agricola could claim to have, but only very briefly, and in reality he didn't, I don't think. Severus certainly didn't. So therefore you end up with this exponentially large military presence in the far north of Britain. I estimate 12% of the Roman military establishment in what is only 4% of the empire's territory, because of the fact the far north is never conquered. And therefore, even though there's not a huge amount written about it by contemporary sources, there is campaigning still taking place after the Agricola and Flavian period in the 2nd century AD, notably under Hadrian in the AD 110s and AD 120s. Of course, Hadrian then comes to Britain with Legio VI Victrix to replace the disappeared Legio IX Hispana, subject to one of my forthcoming books, through pen and sword. And he comes to Britain in AD 122, and then under Antoninus Pius, when you have a campaign driving north, which pushes the line of the northern frontier from Hadrian's Wall to the Antonine Wall briefly. There's then trouble in the AD 180s in the reign of Commodus, when again there's trouble in the far north of Britain, and this crescendos in the AD 190s after the assassination of Commodus and the year of the 5 emperors in AD 193, and then the trouble after the accession of Severus as the emperor. So in the very, very late AD 190s, you find that the by now newly formed, newly named confederations in the far north of Britain, Maeatae and the Caledonians, are being bought off by the Romans with huge subsidies because they can't find a way of pacifying them because of trouble more broadly in the province. So moving on to the next slide, that's a lovely picture of Hadrian's Wall, which is simply there because I love that picture of Hadrian's Wall and I love Hadrian's Wall. And moving on, this is an interesting slide because here I'm going to show you the next 2 slides, the change that takes place in the later 2nd century AD in the far north of Britain. This is the Scottish borders clearly. Have the line of Hadrian's Wall, the Brigantes, the northern Britons below it and probably above it as well. But then you get these various tribes which are detailed in contemporary sources, all the way through to the middle of the 2nd century AD. But as we go through to moving on the slide, to the very late 2nd century AD, we suddenly find that these 2 new confederations are being created. So in my opinion, what's happened here is that the tribes and confederations in the Scottish borders and in the Midland Valley, the upper Midland Valley, through contact with the world of Rome, have found a coalescence of power around greater political entities, such that you end up with the Caledonians and Maeatae. So the Maeatae, by the time of the Severn Campaigns, are either side of the Antonine Wall, in my opinion, and the Caledonians are to their north in the upper Midland Valley and into the Highlands of Scotland. Now, ignore those marching camps because we're going to come back to them, but there's a taste of what we're going to talk about later in terms of the campaign. Moving on. So let's have a short biography of Septimius Severus to give us some real flavour of this great warrior emperor. So this is Lepsis Magna, where he was born. I'll go into his family tree in a minute. This is Severn, Lepsis Magna, after he visited it as emperor, where he bestowed great wealth on the city of his birth, and he rebuilt vast swathes of it. So this is the Severn harbour. You can see the governor's palace in the foreground. That's Severn. You can see the amphitheatre. This is Severn. You can see the theatres. They're all Severn. You can see the basilica and forum. This is all Severn. Severus, like many Roman emperors, but in particular Severus, was a great believer in what I like to term monumentalization. So he liked to do things big to display that he was a man of power. This reflects the way that he became the emperor, as we'll learn later. So let's move on to where he came from geographically. So this is North Africa. This is Roman North Africa. Bottom right, you'll see Lepsis Magna and Tripolitania. part of the province of Africa Proconsularis. And this was a very wealthy part of the Roman Empire, which is why Lepsius Magna and Severus's family were very wealthy, because of the huge arable farming that took place there, the olive oil farming that took place there, and many other industries as well. This is part of the breadbaskets of the Roman Empire, which helped, along with Egypt and Sicily, to feed the great cities, notably Rome in Italy. So there was huge amounts of wealth to be made. So let's have a look at, moving on, how Severus's family made their wealth. So here's the Severus family tree, and it starts sort of fairly high up and then sort of like goes downhill quite quickly. So the first man that we know of who was an ancestor of Severus was Septimius Severus, who chose not to style himself with a Roman name. So he would have been Severus's great-grandfather. And at this time, the great and the good and Lepsius Magna were perfectly happy to just live with their own heritage they'd grown up with, and didn't feel the need to display their Roman heritage. However, that changed with the generation of Severus's grandfather, because you can see here his grandfather moving down the family tree is called Septimius Severus, confusingly, and he does style himself with a Roman name, and he turns into the great man of Lepsius Magna. He's the man who makes all the family wealth, and he's the great man of Lepsius Magna. Sadly, Septimius Severus's father, Septimius Geta, for some reason was one of the failures of the family. He inherited wealth, but he didn't make his own name. It's thought he was actually ill. But he had a daughter and two sons, and one of the sons was Septimius Severus. And we can see here Septimius Severus ultimately crescendos for the family, because he becomes the emperor of the Roman Empire. Goodness me, how amazing is that? I mean, from humble origins, given the family tree there. And the mother of his two children is the great love of his life, his second wife, Julia Domna, who I'll discuss later. Then we go on to the downhill movement of the family tree. So we have his sons Caracalla and Geta. Caracalla is psychotic. Geta is the mummy's boy, apparently one of mummy's boy, but also unfortunate, because many of you will know it's Caracalla who assassinates or has assassinated Geta shortly after Septimius Severus dies, when Severus wanted them to be diarch emperors ruling jointly. So this fails. The next in the family tree is Heliogabalus or Elagabalus, who is, I would argue, a lunatic. And then the final one of the family tree is Alexander Severus, who is a genuine mummy's boy and gets assassinated by Maximinus Thrax, which is the event which ushers in the crisis of the 3rd century. Everything crescendos with Severus and goes downhill. So this is a very unfortunate dynasty. So there's a sad aspect to the story, which I'll come back to when I discuss his legacy. So if we move on. So Severus is the first of his family to become a senator, a member of the senatorial class, the very top of the Roman aristocracy. His father could have, having inherited wealth, and his grandfather could have, having made wealth. They were wealthy enough, but they chose to be equestrians instead. But Severus is the first to really bite the bullet and go for it. And he's educated in Rome, and he goes on to the Cursus Honorum, following the sort of family tree. Following the aristocratic pathway for Roman aristocrats to make their name, and this includes postings which are military and postings which are civilian. Interestingly, for the great warrior emperor Septimius Severus, some of these postings are, in actual fact, to start with, almost all civilian. It's almost like he's trying to avoid having a military posting, but this changes as his progress along the Cursus Honorum gathers pace, as we'll see. So if you move on to the next slide. So here we can see the life and career of Septimius Severus through to AD 193, the year of the 5 emperors, when he becomes the emperor. So he enters the Senate in AD 170, and he marries his first wife, Pacia Marciana, in AD 175. Then in AD 180, he gets his first major military posting, which is to become the legionary legate of Legio Force Scidica, which is one of the crack legions on the eastern frontier fighting the Parthians. And there he meets the man who becomes his mentor, who is Pertinax, the subject of another new book I've got coming out in September, titled Pertinax, the son of a slave who became the emperor of Rome. Imagine Russell Crowe saying that. So Pertinax becomes his mentor, because Pertinax is the governor of Syria at the time, as Severus thrives. However, his first wife dies in AD 182, and then he moves to his first senior provincial governorship, which is of Gallia Lugdunensis, which is a strip of territory in Gaul, ranging from the Channel Islands through to Lugdunensis, which is Lyon in the southeast of France, and of Gaul of France. And this is not one of the frontier territories, but it is a major territory. And again, he's following Pertinax here, because by this time, Pertinax is the governor in Britannia. So the two would have known each other yet again. And again, Severus thrives while he's in Gallia Lugdunensis. And then in AD 187, he marries the love of his life, Julia Domna, who is the daughter of the high priest of the sun god Heliogabalus in Syria, in Syrian Emesa. So he clearly had met Julia Domna while he was based in Syria as the legate of Legio for Scythica. But the stories say that he writes to Julia Domna, and she goes by sea and by land and meets him in Lyon, and they get married. And a year later, Caracalla is born, and then a year later, Geta is born, their two sons. Now, in AD 190, Severus is the consul in Rome, so he's reached the top of the sort of like the cursus honorum tree to become the consul in Rome. Then he gets another major governorship. This is a crucial governorship because it's to be governor in Pannonia Superior. Next slide, please. And you can see on the next slide where Pannonia Superior is. It's a key frontier province, because this is the bulwark effectively on the Danube against the Marcomanni and the Germans and the Goths. And this is just after the end of the Marcomannic Wars, which the Romans really struggled to win under Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus and Commodus. And so this is almost guarding the northeastern approaches to Italy. So it's a crucial province, and it positions Severus in a very powerful place when the time comes in AD 193, because here he's got 5 cracked legions with him, not that far from Rome. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll move on to how Severus becomes the emperor. This is in the AD 193, the year of the 5 emperors. So New Year's Eve, AD 192, 193, Commodus is assassinated, and he was assassinated by the Praetorian prefect and the court chamberlain and his own mistress, Marcia. And Marcia tries to poison him, and it fails because Commodus has been drinking and he's having a hot bath. So fortunately, this is a very well planned assassination, because the assassins have a wrestler on hand, as you would, and the wrestler strangles Commodus to death, and therefore there's a vacancy. Now, the Praetorian prefect and the court chamberlain immediately go to the city prefect at the time, who is Pertinax. And he becomes the emperor, and he's the first emperor of the year of the 5 emperors. However, he only lasts 3 months, because he's a very worthy man, and what he wants to do is he wants to become an emperor following the footsteps of his own mentor, Marcus Aurelius. He wants to be a philosopher emperor. But sadly, the Praetorian Guard don't want that. They want some money. But Commodus has bankrupted the Roman fiscus treasury, so therefore Pertinax can't give them any. So eventually, 3 months after he becomes the emperor, he's assassinated. And then famously, Didius Julianus, a senior senator, bribes the Praetorian Guard to become the emperor. And at this point, Severus learns that Pertinax has been assassinated, and he's declared the emperor by his own personal legion where he is, which is Legio 14, Jemima, Marcia, Victrix. And he hot-foots it in sort of almost a sort of a blitzkrieg with a legionary spearhead to Rome, followed by other legions, parks himself in the Forum in Rome, by which time Didius Julianus has been assassinated, and at sword point becomes the emperor by forcing the Senate to acknowledge him as the emperor. And this is how he becomes the emperor. And this is why Severus always hates the political classes of Rome, because from that point there's a break between the two, because he's the warrior who's forced his way to become the emperor in a coup, effectively, and the political classes don't like him. The public in Rome do, but the political classes largely don't. And as we'll see, this plays out across his entire time as the emperor. He's only got 2 opponents now who could possibly stop him thriving as emperor. One is the governor in Britain, Clodius Albinus, and one is the governor in Syria, who's called Pescennius Niger. So what does Severus do next? Well, he's very clever. Before I look at that, though, this is Pertinax. This is Severus's mentor. And here you can see a bust of Pertinax, which is in the Vatican Museum in Rome. I was actually there only last year, and I had a very nice photograph of my arm around him, which I occasionally use in my Twitter posts. This is a statue which nobody will know who he is. I get millions walk past him every year, but I hope when my book comes out they will. This is his bust from the villa at Luddingstone in Kent, which has been defaced after his assassination. So there you can see what happens to emperors when they ultimately fail. So back to the narrative and Severus. He's the emperor. So the first thing he does is buys off Albinus in Britain by making him his Caesar. Then he mounts a campaign in the east, this first campaign, where he defeats Niger and then campaigns against the Parthians and their allied states. Then you have the usurpation of Albinus in Britain, which almost topples Severus, because Albinus brings the 3 British legions, gathers a legion from Gaul, gathers troops from Spain, and then ends up fighting a titanic battle with Severus in Loudun of Lyon, which Severus only just wins. And from that point onwards, he only thinks unwell of Britain because of the fact that he nearly lost his throne to the British governor. And Severus decapitates Albinus and then tramples ceremoniously over Albinus's headless body on his charger, and then he starts scourging Britannia effectively, and he sends commissioners to Britain to bring the recalcitrant province back into the imperial throne. And I'll show you in a minute one of the imperial fold, and I'll show you in a minute one of the key things that Severus does in actual fact, which is a legacy which survives to this very day of his response to him nearly losing his throne to the British governor. He then makes his name as the Great Warrior Emperor by defeating Parthia and sacking the Parthian capital Ctesiphon. And so he's basically defeated the main Roman opponent in the east. This is a very big thing. Not many Roman emperors can do this. Returns to Rome, where he's bored, then campaigns in Britain in AD 208 to 211, and finally dies in York in AD 211. There you can see the Parthian capital Ctesiphon, sacked by Severus. So moving on. So not many people know this, but Septimius Severus is the Roman emperor who, arguably after Claudius, whose invasion set the province in place, has had the biggest impact on Roman London. Because one of the things that Severus did, remember he believes in monumentalization, is he builds the land wall of Roman London, which later became the medieval wall, which delineated the square mile, the city of London. So the city of London that we know today is defined by a wall built by Septimius Severus, a Roman emperor, to send a message to the people who were living in London at the time, the elites there. Remember, there's no external threat here at the time in London. It's a message to the people who were living in London, the elites. You misbehaved once. If I can do this, build this immense wall, just think what I can do to you if you misbehave again. So this is Severn monumentalization. And his other legacy in Britain is in York, because of course he turns York, moving on to the next slide, into his imperial capital for the 3 years that he's based there. So this is Severn York. You can see here the Canabae civilian settlement on the south of the River Ouse. You can see where the west of the Canabae is, that's where the railway station, railway museum is today. You can see the legionary fortress with its Principia and Praetorium in the middle. That's what Severus used as his imperial capital, basically, while he was based there, and that's where Severus died. So this is Severn York. And when you go down, as you'll see in a minute, in fact, we'll move on to the next slide, please. As we'll see later, one of the Severn legacies, and when you go down to beneath the Minster in York, you'll see some painted wall plaster there. Well, I think that dates to the Severn period. That's where Severus died. So that is really Severus' legacy in York writ large. So when you move on to Severn Rome, because Severus has a big legacy in Rome as well. So we can see here, this is the parade on the left that Severus mounted with Julie Domna, having his triumph after his second campaign when he defeated the Parthians, which he then celebrated by building the Monumental Arch. So the Arch of Septimus Severus is there to celebrate his conquest of the Parthians. And if we move on, we can see the inscription at the top, which records the Severn campaigns. This is an amazing arch, because as we'll see when I talk about the Severn military, you can track the changes Severus initiated in place with the Roman military from the images on this arch. But one of the things I'll point out, on the inscription on the top, where you see a name removed, that's Geta, his youngest son, who had a damnatio memoria declared against him by the psychotic Caracalla, and therefore, having had the damnatio memoria carried out against him, he never existed. So his name was removed. And I'll show you a very sad image of that at the end of the presentation. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going back to a theme here, monumentalization with Severus. So this is the Arch of Septimius Severus, which is at the top of the Forum Romanum in Rome. One of the things I like doing when I'm doing my tours there for Andante Travels is I like sort of walking towards the arch with my whisper system on, talking to the guests about what they can interpret on the arch. But then I point towards the Senate Curia on the right-hand side. Severus built his arch there at the end of the 2nd century AD, beginning of the 3rd century AD, with a very specific message in mind. Not just to celebrate his own victory. Remember, there would have been a golden chariot allegedly on top, with he and Caracalla and Geta being towed by 4 horses, and the chariot had wings on. So this was a monument in its own right, but it had another message. The message was to the senators and the curia on the right-hand side, because the arch is actually built on top partly of the foundations of the Senate Curia. And again, this is Severn monumentalization, saying to the senators in the Senate House, who he'd forced to acknowledge him as emperor at sword point, you behave or else. Severn monumentalization. If we move on to the next slide, we can see the Severn Legacy in the Forum Romanum as an example is all over the place. This is the Temple of Vesta, which was rebuilt by Julia Domna after the original was burnt during the reign of Commodus. And if we move on to the next slide, the majority of the Imperial Palace on the Palatine Hill, this dates to the Severn period. So these are the Severn buildings, which you can see on the on the western side of the Palatine Hill. You can actually see inside the reception chambers and reception rooms and the Imperial Palace. As we'll move on to the next slide, this is the view of the viewing platform, which is a recreation of the viewing platform from the Severn buildings of the Imperial Palace. And this is the view of the Circus Maximus, which Severus and Julia Domna, Caracalla and Geta, the court chamberlain, the Praetorian prefect would have had. And moving on, there's another view. This is what they'd have seen. But now I'm going to drift over with the next slide. I'm going to drift over westwards. As we drift over westwards through the shimmering heat haze, you can see here the Baths of Caracalla. Now, the Baths of Caracalla were originally going to be called the Baths of Septimius Severus. The reason they're so grand is because this was going to be his great monumental legacy. You can hear Hector yawning in the background. The great monumental legacy of Severus and Julia Domna's time in Rome. This is a great couple. Julia Domna was a great patron of the arts, for example, in Rome. And this was going to be their legacy, the Baths of Septimius Severus. But of course, although it was initiated in his reign, he died before it was finished. And so Caracalla obviously pinched it and renamed it in his own name. But it should have been the Baths of Septimius Severus, but he died in York in AD 211. So now the reforms of the Severn military. This is one of the new things my research allowed me to, my PhD research allowed me to bring to the book on Septimius Severus in Scotland for the first time, to talk about him being the first of the great reforming emperors of the Roman Principate military and the Roman military of the empire, in actual fact. So broadly through to the time of Septimius Severus, the Principate military broadly being sort of fairly sort of standard. Here you can see some auxiliaries from the Arch of Septimius Severus. Moving on to the next slide. Here you can see some classic Principate legionaries on the Trajan's column. This is Trajan's column. So here you can see the Lorica segmentata. Here you can see the Imperial Gallic helmets. Here you can see the square scrutum shields. You can see the pilum throwing javelins, the gladius swords. This is that classic Principate legionary. Move on to the next slide. We now move on to a very confusing arch. This is the Arch of Constantine, which is obviously much later, from about AD 315. However, when Constantine built his arch at the foot of the Forum Romanum, he was broke. So therefore, he reused panels from earlier monuments, and this is a panel reused from a lost arch of Marcus Aurelius. So again, Principate military, and again we see the classic Principate military here with the banded iron armour and with the Imperial Gallic helmets, etc. However, let's move on to the next slide. I painted that figure, I'm quite proud of that. This figure I bought is called a Severn legionary. And it's called a Severn Legionary because although he's got aspects of the Principate Legionary, he's got the lorica segmentata, he's got the Gallic helmet, he's got the scutum shield, he's holding a spear. He's not holding a pilum javelin. And also, you can't see here, but his sword's different as well. He's got a spatha longer sword, not a gladius hispaniensis. Why is this? Well, let's have a look at the narrative. Moving on to the next slide. Onto the Arch of Septimius Severus. Here we can see another change taking place. So this is a legionary, the lorica segmentata. And he's got his shield, but it's a round shield. It's not a squared off scutum shield. So again, we're beginning to see a change. This is a time machine we're looking at now in the Arch of Septimius Severus. Moving on to the next slide. And this is one of the great panels. It's quite weathered now, but you can see it much better close up. This is one of the depictions on the Arch of Septimius Severus of his eastern campaigns in his second campaign. And here we can see him fighting on the bottom panel. You can see him fighting on the right-hand side there, Parthian cataphracts, fully armoured cavalry, man and horse. On the left-hand side, close up, you can see that these are legionaries which are carrying spears and have got rounded shields. So a transition is beginning to take place from the classic Principate Legionary to the later Roman Legionary. It begins here with Septimius Severus. Not all his legionaries had changed, and even those that hadn't gone the whole way toward the late Roman Legionary, but the change begins here. Moving on to the next slide. And we can see the change maturing now, going back to the Arch of Constantine, because here we can see the later Roman Legionary with his round plank shield and his spear and a very different kind of helmet, moving back to having the lorica, hamata, chainmail, etc. So this change begins with Severus at the beginning of the 3rd century AD and matures with Constantine at the beginning of the 4th century AD. And moving on to the next slide, we can see on the bottom here this change in real time. So we have the Marian and Caesarian Legionary, we have the Principate Legionary, we have the Severn Legionary, moving on to the later Roman Legionaries. Well, the legionary in the middle, number 4, that's the Severn Legionary. This is where the change begins. Finally here, talking about Severus in the military, Severus was very much a military man, even though early in the Cursus Honorum he chose not to follow a military career. He really made up for it later in life. And these are the famous words, of course, which the contemporary sources put in his mouth on his deathbed to Caracalla and Geta: be harmonious with each other, enrich the soldiers and scorn everybody else. Sadly, we know the first bit they chose to completely ignore. Moving on, let's talk about the Expeditio Felissima Britannica, which is a piece of epigraphy which comes from the north of Britain, contemporary to the Severn Campaigns, and reflects how contemporary sources view these campaigns as the Expeditio Felissima Britannica. So I'll go into detail in a minute, but broadly the narrative of this is as follows. AD 207, Herodian says that Severus receives a letter in Rome saying there's trouble in Britain and we need your help. I'll go into detail in a minute. Severus buys into this big style, and in AD 207 later on orders the Roman military across the entirety of the West to get ready to gather to go and campaign in Britain. In 208, Severus and his enormous army arrive in Britain and go to York, which becomes the imperial capital for the last 3 years of his life. And he brings with him his family, members of the Senate, even the imperial fiscus treasury. So this is an enormous commitment on his part. And then he has his first campaign in Scotland in AD 209. And then in AD 210, he has his second campaign in Scotland. And this is when the genocide occurs. And then he dies in York in AD 211. And this is when Caracalla and Geta return to Rome. And then by the end of the year, Caracalla has either murdered or had murdered Geta, who allegedly dies in his mother's arms. So we'll move on to the next slide. So why did he initiate this exponentially large, enormous, way too big, almost certainly, campaign to conquer the far north of Britain? Well, one, this is the great warrior emperor who was born in Rome. He allegedly became angry when he heard that the British governor Senecio had been campaigning successfully in the north of Britain, when Severus himself had to deal with bandits in the Apennine Mountains. So therefore, Severus is born in Rome, and the warrior emperor wants to go back on campaign again. Also, the contemporary sources say that Caracalla and Geta are misbehaving badly, young rich men in Rome, etc. But also Caracalla is beginning to behave psychotically towards Geta as well. So he wants to get them in a situation where they can start engaging. in a military life, not misbehaving Rome. Then we have how Severus would have viewed his success as emperor to that date. All Roman emperors tried to match themselves to the great Augustus. And of course, we have this wonderful poem from Horace who says that Augustus will only be a god if he defeats the Persians and the pesky Britons. Well, Severus has already defeated the Persians, so therefore he's got the last challenge to prove he's even better than Augustus, because Augustus did neither. He can go and conquer the Britons, then he can say, I'm better than Augustus, I'm now the Roman emperor, by whom all of the Roman emperors will starve themselves. This is also his last chance at military glory, because he was ill. I mean, he was suffering very badly from gout, and in actual fact, in the campaign in Britain, he was carried in a sedan chair for most of it. So he was ill, so he knew he'd probably got one last chance at martial glory. Also, he may well have left the northern border undermanned simply because he didn't trust Britain because of what had happened under Albinus and the usurpation. So therefore, what you may find had happened is the natives in the far north of Britain, the Maeatae and the Caledonians and anybody else there, could have seen an opportunity for plunder and for wealth and for their own glory. And so you end up with this situation in 207 where Senesio's letter, according to Herodian, arrives, and it says to the emperor, this is very important, look at the wording here, the island will be overrun. The island, not the north, the island will be overrun, maybe it will be overrun. I need the emperor or reinforcements. This is almost certainly a conceit by Herodian. If this letter ever existed, by the way, it may have been, the whole opportunity may have been manufactured by Severus to have this last chance of glory. But let's say the letter did exist. It's unlikely the whole island would have been overrun, but clearly in the north there was a major issue, some kind of massive crisis which needed either the emperor or reinforcements. And the governor got both. He got the Severn surge, Roman shock and awe in the far north of Britain. And I've discussed the Caledonians and the Maeatae, so we'll move on to the next slide. So what did the Severn Force comprise? So this is shock and awe at large. We're talking about 57,000 men, the largest campaigning force ever on British soil, which arrives through the eastern coast ports of Richborough and London and Venta Icenorum on the Great Estuary in East Anglia, and Brough-on-Humber and South Shields. And it's based in York. And I argue in my book on Severus in Scotland, it becomes the first Roman field army. There's a picture there of Venta Icenorum in East Anglia. So moving on to the next slide. So specifically, what did it comprise? This 50,000 foot troops in particular, well, it comprised the Praetorian Guard, who Severus had doubled in size when he became the emperor, recreating it using his own Danubian veterans. It included the Imperial Guard cavalry, which he also doubled in size. It included the Severn Legion founding Legio II Parthica. He founded 3 legions for his Parthian campaigns. His own personal legion effectively was II Parthica, which he based near Rome. So he almost certainly took II Parthica with him. He had the 3 British legions, Legio II Augusta at Caerleon, Legio 20 Valeria Victrix in Chester, there's another typo there, and Legio 6 Augusta in York. And then he had 15,000 British auxiliaries. Then he had vexillations, so regiments from the Rhine and Danubian legions of auxilia. Finally, he had the 7,000 men of the Classis Britannica, Roman Navy in Britain, subject to my first book, The Seagulls of Empire. So this is your 57,000 men, the largest ever campaigning force on British soil. So moving on to the next slide. So some lovely pictures coming up. So this is looking at the Classis Britannica. This is a Liburne, which is the kind of galley, a bireme, quite nippy biremes, which the Romans would have used in their regional fleets by this time, not the big polyreme galleys of the late Republic. We now have these nippy regional fleet galleys, the Liburne, named after pirate ships. Which would have had a ballista and they have their ram, etc. But it's a classic design. And I'll now move on in the next slide to one of my favourite ever pieces of archaeology. This was found about 10 years ago near the Saxon shore fort of Brancaster, which is an early Saxon shore fort, and it dates to around AD 210 to 20 when the Classis Britannica still existed. This is a waste piece of Roman lead on which somebody who saw a ship of the Classis Britannica drew a piece of graffiti. This is a ship of the Classis Britannica seen through the eyes of somebody who saw one in real life. You can see here the planking, you can see the shields down the side, you can see the ram, you can see the foresail, you can see the main mast with the sail not furled yet. this is a wonderful piece of archaeology, and this is a ship of the Classis Britannica as Severus himself would have viewed one. So moving on to a key aspect of these campaigns, 57,000 men, 50,000 foot troops, 7,000 of the regional fleet. This is going to need an enormous logistical undertaking. So you can see here the East Coast ports which would have been engaged. So we have Richborough, we have Dover, we have London, we have Brough-on-Humber, and then we have South Shields, which becomes a major logistics base for these campaigns. Then if we look towards the Forth, the Romans used Cramond, and then they also on the Tay used Carpu as well, as I will demonstrate. This is what one of these supply bases would have looked like. So imagine South Shields looking like this. This is the Roman military harbour at Caledonian in southeastern Wales. Moving on to the next slide. This is an interpretation of what South Shields would have looked like at the time of the Severn Campaigns, because he increased the size of the granaries there by a factor of 10. So there's enough grain there to keep 50,000 men in the field without any other resupply for at least 2 months. Next slide. And then moving on to the Forth, this is Cramond. Again, you have a major supply base there, tracking as the Romans jump up further and further north. And moving on, this is one of the barrack blocks at Cramond on the Forth. And moving on to one of my favourite Roman sites in the north of Fife on the Tay. This is Carpu. This is an amazing crop mark, which you can see of the Principia of the Vexillation Fort supply base and harbour at Carpu. And I actually was very fortunate to be able to carry out a field walk across the site, because researching my Romans in the North Turf and Andante travels, I knocked on one of the local doors, and they really kindly allowed me to walk on their fields. It's a farmer's field, and you can see the Roman fort there, literally in the plough soil. This is, in this image, the Tay's behind me, and I'm looking at the site of the Roman fort at Carpu, which became such an important part of the campaign. So here, what I want you to look at here is broadly the pathway, the strategy which the Romans followed. So the Roman strategy employed by Severus was brutally simple and efficient. He had a force of 50,000 legionaries and auxilia, and on the coast he had naval support from the 7,000. This is moving on to the next map. So if you jump one slide on to the next map. That's the one. So here you can see the campaign writ large. So we have 50,000 warriors crossing the frontier as one homogeneous force, blasting their way through what we now call the Scottish borders, and building marching camps each night to house the 50,000 men in one camp. These are 70-hectare sized marching camps, some of the largest in the entirety of the Roman Empire. And they follow the line of Dere Street, eviscerating all before them. We think that at the time, a lot of the refugees and captives were sent to the south of Hadrian's Wall, where they were put in concentration camps, perhaps one of them at Vindolanda, which was drastically changed in form during this period. Then this huge force gets to Inveresk on the Forth, turns to the west and continues along the Forth, where it gets to a bridging point, maybe around South Queensferry, where a bridge of boats, possibly 500 boats in size, is then built across the Forth to the Upper Midland Valley. Then Severus divides his force into two. The first force under Caracalla, I argue, is 2/3 strong, 2/3 of the force, including probably the British legions who got all the experience campaigning in the north at the time. They cross over the bridge of boats, and then they follow the Highland boundary fault, so the Highland line, and they close off all of the glens and later build glen block of forts and marching camps, obviously, as they track where they're going. And we can follow the campaign Caracalla mounted here by the marching camp sites which are attributed to this period. And eventually they get to near Stonehaven and the Highlands are cut off. But at the same time, the regional fleet is cutting off the coast. So now the native Britons in the upper Midland Valley and Five are trapped and they have nowhere to go and they can get no reinforcements. So now Severus launches the third of the force, probably including the Praetorian Guard, probably including Legio II Parthica, into the soft underbelly. He crosses the Forth, he goes through Five, he builds 2 marching camps, he gets to Carpoo, he builds his own bridge of boats over the Tay, crosses into the upper Midland Valley, and you have the most brutal campaign take place. The most brutal campaign take place, which I'll detail in a moment. So if we move on to the next slide, we have here a classic image of the Romans building marching camps. Remember, the Roman military at the end of every marching day build a marching camp to protect themselves in enemy territory, and that would have looked like as follows. On the next slide, there's a stylized image of what one of the marching camps would have looked like. What we have here is effectively a Roman fort, but temporary in nature. So it's a highly defendable fortification which the Romans used, and which leaves crop marks, which leaves archaeology, which enables us to track them today, which is how we can follow the Severn campaigns in Scotland. Move on to the next slide. There are specifically from my Severus in Scotland book the exact marching camps which the Romans used. So you dot to dot to dot to dot along. So everyone's together going to the Forth, then they separate going over the Forth. The top line from south east, so southwest to northeast is the Caracalla campaign. And then Severus going through Five and into the Low Midland Valley is the marching camps in Fife. So that is how we know where Severus went in his campaigns. So moving on. All my friends from the Tremontium Trust in the borders, I've got some lovely photographs for you here. And this is obviously Dere Street going past the Roman fort at Tremontium near Melrose. Fantastic site to visit. I recommend anybody to go there. And there's the Tremontium stone. And in the foreground, you have the site where you have the the Flavian and Antonine fort, Tremontium. To give you an example of the scale of the Severn marching camp, the Flavian and Antonine fort is in the ploughed field you can see. The Severn marching camp, which is 70 hectares in size, is that entire fieldscape in the background. That's how big Severus's force was. So this is an unstoppable force. This is very, very asymmetrical in nature, this conflict. Moving on. Here we can see a bridge of boats. This is a classic image which you find on Trajan's column, Trajan in his 2 Dacian campaigns. So this is the kind of bridge of boats which would have, I argue, have crossed the Forth and the Tay. And then moving on. This is the Roman fort site and also nearby Severn marching camp site at Arduk. Again, showing the scale of the Roman engagement in this region. And then moving on. This is one of my favourite images actually in my entire deck. It almost puts the hairs upon the back of my neck, because what you're looking at here is a view of the Highlands, the Highland boundary fault and the Highland line, from the Gasque Ridge series of Roman watchtowers, which were set on the Gasque Ridge to keep an eye on what was going on the Highland line, and almost certainly this would have been reused and refortified during the Severn campaigns. So you're getting a Roman soldier's eye view of what the Highland line would have looked like. And remember, in these campaigns as well, the weather was appalling, worse than usual. So this is a very good image to actually sort of get a contemporary feel to the campaigns from a Roman perspective. So the campaigns, and I'm almost finished now. So the campaigns, the one in AD 209 was brutal. It was a savage onslaught, and it followed the strategy I've demonstrated with the maps. There was no meeting engagement in the like Agricola's campaigns in the late 1st century AD, with allegedly his Battle of Mons Graupius, because the Severn strategy was so brutal that the native Britons, I argue, just couldn't coalesce into a fighting force. So it turned into a brutal guerrilla campaign. And it wasn't all one way. The Romans suffered huge numbers of casualties. Dio says the Romans lost 50,000 men. Clearly a conceit, because the force was probably only 50,000 men and the 7,000 sailors of the fleet. But clearly this is an absolutely brutal campaign. One of the interesting things you have here is that the natives allegedly used some kind of appetite suppressant to enable them to campaign in the field for a long time, which has recently been identified as the heath pea. In the end, though, weight of numbers told in the Romans' favour, and the natives ultimately had to sue for peace, agreeing terms favourable for Rome. You have a patricide attempt here, allegedly, when Herodian says that Caracalla, as Severus was about to sign the peace treaty, put his hand on his sword to try and kill his father, but he was spotted by Severus's close bodyguards and stopped. And then you have coins and medallions minted to victory, and Severus and Caracalla are named Britannicus to celebrate their victory. So all is well in the far north of Britain. The campaign is successful. But is it? Well, clearly not, because the Maeatae and the Caledonians rebel over the winter of AD 209-210, and so the campaign is repeated in full again in AD 210. This time out, though, only under Caracalla, because Severus is too ill with whatever illness he's got to campaign. And this is the year when Severus orders the genocide. So moving on. What is Severus's legacy, therefore, from this enormous commitment to try and conquer Scotland? Well, sadly, Severus dies in York in February AD 211. So therefore, the political will to give this great warrior emperor his last hurrah, his last martial conquest, disappears with his death in the freezing British winter in February AD 211. And Caracalla and Geta can't wait to get back to Rome. Remember, Severus has tried to make them diarchs, emperors in the style of Marcus Aurelius Lucius Verus, but certainly Caracalla hates Geta, who's a more popular figure in Rome, and clearly behaves psychotically towards him. And by the time they get to Rome, by the end of the year, Caracalla has killed Geta. So therefore, the military force disperses over the next year or so. Gradually, the Roman frontier drops down to the line of Hadrian's Wall again, where it broadly is to stay for the rest of the Roman occupation of Britain. The Romans never again try a conquest, certainly of this scale, certainly Agricolan scale and Severn scale at the far north of Britain. So was the effort worth it? Well, did Severus conquer the far north? No, he didn't. He was an absolute failure. This enormous commitment of men, the deaths involved, the savagery towards the native population, the decimation of the local economy, the cost of all parties, it's complete and utter waste of time, because with his death, there's no political will to stay in the far north. You could argue, though, that it did bring peace to the far north of Scotland, because evidently through the archaeological record, so for example, the lack of settlement for the next 80 years, the reforestation that takes place in certainly in Fife and in the upper Midland Valley and the Scottish borders, certainly in the east, there is a peace because there's very few people left because of the savagery of the conflict. And we only get word that there's trouble in the north of Britain again about 80 years later. So you could make the case that it was successful from that point of view, but just at this enormous cost. But of course, there's an enormous cost to Severus's own family as well. This is Severus admonishing Caracalla for trying to assassinate him at the peace treaty signing, but also you can read into this Severus telling his sons to love each other and the military ignore everybody else. Clearly, it fails totally. And so the Severn dynasty peaks with Severus and it goes downhill rapidly thereafter. And this is the image I wanted to show you to show how sad this is with this Damnatio Memoria. This is from the Arch of Septimius Severus, and you're seeing here Caracalla with his Parthian captive. The face top left, that's Geta, who's had his face removed because of the Memoria, the Damnatio Memoria. But not only has he had his own face removed, you can see here that his captive has had his face removed as well, because if Geta had never existed, then clearly the captive had never existed as well. This is a very sad legacy for his own family. However, hopefully the story of Severus in Scotland marches on through my research, and later this year you'll get Severus the prequel in Pertinax, the son of a slave who became the Emperor of Rome. Moving on to my final slide. In actual fact, I'll just leave that slide there. If you go back one slide, Claire, go forward one. Just to hold that there, that's the slide I was talking about for everybody, with Caracalla declaring his Damnatio Memoria and Geta's face being removed. It's a very sad story. Moving on to my final slide, this is the home page slide. Severus marches on, and the next one, please, Claire, the final slide. If anybody wants to get in touch with me to talk about my research, all my contacts are there. I do an awful lot of work and present a lot of my intellectual property on Twitter. So please do follow me on @SimonElliott20. and I'll be launching a new website next week as well. And I just want to say I'm very proud to have been able to give this talk on behalf of the Council for British Archaeology, where I'm honoured to be a trustee. It's an amazing organisation, and I think Claire's got a few words to say before we take questions.
Hi everyone, just bear with me a second. I'll just pop on to the next slide. So thank you very much, Simon. That was fantastic. I'm sure everyone will agree with me that that was an excellent presentation. Before we move on to some questions and answers from Simon, I've just got a quick poll I'd like to share from you. We'd really like to get your feedback so that we can find out what you thought of tonight's talk, but also so that we can look at how we can make the Festival of Archaeology better for next year. So I'm just going to pop a poll up on the screen here, and if you wouldn't mind just clicking your answers, and when you've done that, please do use the question and answer box to share your questions, and Simon will answer them for you in just a moment.
Just to add there, by the way, I just want to say thank you very much to Claire for helping me tonight. If any of those slides were out of sequence, that's my fault entirely, because my technology is not very good. So I'm using a very old Mac, and Claire very kindly stepped in to click through my deck for me. So thank you so much, Claire.
You are very welcome. I'll just leave that up for one moment. Do you want to start answering some questions, Simon, while people are finishing off?
Go for it. Go for it. Let's do it.
So we've got a question from Gordon here. He's asking, what evidence is there for Roman naval activity in the Clyde, specifically Classis support to secure or supply marching camps, and have any remains of harbour or coastal structures been found from those times?
Very good question, Gordon. I can't off the top of my head remember the exact examples, but there are specific examples, and you'll forgive me for plugging my book Seagulls of Empire. I actually list them in great detail there. And you also might be able to find them detailed in my PhD thesis, which you can find for free on the University of Kent website as well. So in the first instance, have a look at my PhD thesis, which you can just Google Simon Elliott, University of Kent, Ragstone, because it's about the Roman quarries which built Roman London, where I argue the Classis Britannica actually ran them. But in there, I talk about the Navy more broadly, and I actually detail in there where these bases are. So yes, there is evidence, Gordon.
Brilliant. And we've got Andre asking if they can get that people can see the slides afterwards to study the subject further. So shall I just say there, Simon, we've recorded the presentation tonight, and we're going to edit it, and we'll be sharing it on our CBA YouTube channel. So hopefully we'll be able to have that up there by the end of the week for you.
So the answer there, Andrew, is absolutely. We aim to please.
So Pauline says, thank you very much, really enjoyed it. And then we've got Brian, who's asking, where did the wealth come from to fund the army and the campaigns?
It's a really great question, actually, that is, and I'll tell you why. Because when Pertinax became the emperor in AD 193, after the assassination of Commodus, the fiscus, the treasury, was bust, because Commodus had lived such a ridiculously over the top lifestyle that he basically spent everything, and I think the treasury was down to a tenth of what it should be. But what you have with Severus, he's a hard man emperor, and once he becomes the emperor, he really tightens the screws across the empire and makes sure that the taxes are all paid on time, etc. And as the emperor, it's his whim if he chooses to spend the money not on a lavish lifestyle as with Commodus, but on trying to conquer the far north of Britain, that then he's spending the money from his own treasury. So effectively, it's his own cash.
Brilliant. So we've got another thank you from Karen, who is all the way in Silicon Valley in California.
My pleasure, Karen. Welcome, welcome.
And then we have a question from Simon, who asks, Wall of Severus, did it exist? Where?
Wall of Severus?
Yes.
This is a name by which Hadrian's Wall was known in the antiquarian period, because in some of the later Latin chroniclers, they style Hadrian's Wall as Severus's Wall. The reason being that the wall was heavily repaired and rebuilt towards the end of the Severn period in Britain, because it's where the line of the northern border dropped down to after the Severn Campaigns. So it's basically a miscommunication from the Latin chroniclers through antiquarians.
Okay, so we've got a question from Alistair, who asks, in your slides you suggest that the Caledonians, and forgive my pronunciation here, is it the Maeatae?
So
Simon.
Claire, don't worry, I can't pronounce it either. I've written a book about it.
You know who I mean. Their motivation was partly driven by hunger. Can you expand on that?
Well, one of the interesting things is that you have this period in the AD 190s, towards the end of the 190s, where the two tribes are named for the first time by Dio in the late Antonine period. And clearly, the population's growing because you have this coalescence of power, more stability, the population's growing. Then you have this huge amount of wealth put their way to buy them off in the very late AD 190s, while Severus is trying to rebuild the northern frontier after the Albinus's campaigns in Britain. So there's a growing population, but at the same time, we know in the build-up to the Severn campaigns, certainly in the Severn campaigns, the weather was appalling. So you might have had what is styled as harvest shock. So 2 or 3 bad harvests. So you had this conundrum where you have a growing population but less food, which may have been a factor driving the natives in the far north of Britain to take the risk of really tweaking the Romans. And they just picked the wrong time to do it, because they just gave Severus an opportunity to try and prove his worth once again. It's worth remembering as well there, Claire, that while Severus was in York before the first campaign, the natives clearly realised they'd bitten off more than they could chew, because they actually tried to do a peace deal, but Severus had gone too far along the line to allow him to do a peace deal before the event, because he would have lost face. It also gives insight there into why he was doing it, to gain martial favour, etc. So I hope that answers your question.
Brilliant. I just spotted in the chat, Simon, that we have Rosalind with us, who lives in Severus Avenue in York.
Fantastic. Welcome.
So we've got a question from Hilary about the camps in Vindolanda. Can you say more about them?
Yeah, it's a really great point, actually, Claire. Who asked the question?
Hilary.
Hilary. Hi, Hilary. Thank you for the question. It's a really great question. It's one of the things actually I found out researching the book. In fact, Tony Burley, who proved to be, was my proofreader actually, which I didn't realise until after the event, which would have been very worrying if I'd have known before the event. The world expert on Septimius Severus, proofreading my book on him, he pointed out some new research which I was able to fold into the book, which was that Vindolanda, after the Flavian and Antonine periods, moving into the period of Severus, it appears, according to some research, was flattened around the time of the Severn campaigns, and then it had a street grid pattern, a Roman street grid pattern constructed on it, which then had a housing built along the streets, but the housing were late Iron Age roundhouses, so they were native roundhouses. And one interpretation is that it became effectively a concentration camp for fugitives or captives from the smash and grab raid through the Scottish borders.
Fascinating. And another question, again relating to camps, and that's how did they manage to build the marching camps so quickly? And that's from Lois.
Hi Lois, I'll give you a reference of what happens when it goes wrong. If you look at the movie Spartacus, one of the few things it gets right is the reaction of the Roman senatorial classes when the legate sent to defeat Spartacus in the first campaign loses. The first question Crassus asks him is, "You did build the marching camp, didn't you?" And the answer is no, and therefore is in trouble. The Roman military, from the time of the wars against Pyrrhus Epiphorus, always built a marching camp when they were campaigning in enemy territory at the end of every day's campaign. And the reason they could do it is because they were all the Roman legionaries were trained engineers, but also within the Principate legions of 5,500 men, many of them were also specialists. So there were farriers, stonemasons, woodcutters, tile manufacturers, fletchers, that kind of thing. They all had a skill as well. So these were all trained engineers, and They knew exactly how to, it's almost like an IKEA process, building this kit. Each Roman legionary, as an example, carried engineering kit on his back, so he had a spade, so they dug the ditch, earth from the ditch became the bank. On top of the bank, each Roman legionary carried a stake, and that became the palisade. Absolutely classic behavior of the Romans, actually, when they're occupying an enemy territory. It probably took them 3 hours to build. So imagine marching all day and then spending 3 hours building a camp, a fort, before you can make your daily bread. That's why I argue, actually, Roman legionaries, if you were to look at their body shape today, might almost be like a sort of middleweight Olympic weightlifters, all square and all muscle.
Crikey, that sounds like an amazing feat. I am very glad that I was not one of those soldiers, I have to say.
Me too.
We've got a question from Nathaniel, who says, Cassius Dio states that 50,000 troops were killed. Is there evidence for this atrocity, or modern estimates of the casualties?
Hi, Nathaniel. I estimate, and others estimate, the campaigning force is 50,000 men, plus the 7,000 elites of the regional fleet. And Dio does say that the Romans suffered 50,000 casualties. That's clearly a conceit. So we have no evidence of the number of casualties, so I'm not going to speculate. All I will say is this was a brutal campaign. You know, when Severus gives this order for the genocide in the second campaign in 210, the Romans do behave like this when they're dealing with recalcitrant rebels. Earlier in the Roman conquest of Britain, the Silures in southeastern Wales had a similar order given against them, but that's against a tribe or a confederation. What we have here is something much larger. It's against an entire people. So this is the scale of opposition the Romans are facing. They're in danger of losing. Imagine being in the garrisons in Cramond or Carpu, or in the Glen Block of forts along the Highland line as this rebellion takes place, an incendiary rebellion like the Boudiccan rebellion of AD 60-61, but in the far north of Britain. You know, all these garrisons are going to get massacred. So the Romans do behave brutally and savagely against their opponents. But that's because they've lost a lot of men themselves. But I can't give you a number. Clearly, though, Dio is using it as a conceit to demonstrate how dangerous an opponent the Romans faced in the far north of Britain.
Brilliant. And then we've got a really interesting question here from Neil, who asks, would the Scottish tribes have been able to gain much support from their allies in the northern part of Ireland?
Oh, that's a great question, that is. Let's remember, of course, that Agricola, as part of his campaigns in the far north, at one stage contemplated invading Ireland. So the Romans clearly were well aware of Ireland. Again, you could speculate that as part of the Agricolan campaigns, when the native northern Britons on the west coast of Scotland had to flee Agricola's campaigns, they may have fled to Ireland. You may have had the same thing happening here again. The reality is we don't know. I very much doubt whether any martial help would have come from Ireland, though, for the Severn campaign, simply because the campaigning was along the eastern coast. Severus did visit the west coast of his province as part of his campaigns in Britain, because we know this at Carlisle, probably in late AD 209, early AD 210. But I don't think you'll find troops from the north of Ireland fighting with the Caledonians and Maeatae. Brilliant.
Mark asks, how did the military technology compare between the two sides in the campaigns?
Mark, that's a fantastic question, which is really plays to my strength. There's a huge asymmetry at play here, not only in numbers, but also in the military tactics and technology. I would argue the Romans only faced a symmetrical opponent, i.e. one who, man on man, army on army, of the same number, would be able to fight the Romans at their own game, when you have the Sassanid Persians appear in the east, probably from the later AD 220s, so shortly after the Severn period. But there's a huge asymmetry in play here. The one thing which does play to the strength of the native population, and this is referenced in the primary sources, is the knowledge of the locality and the weather of the locals, which is why they're able to mount this guerrilla campaign, which drives the Romans to ultimately declare this genocide, because they can't find another way of winning. So there's a huge asymmetry in play here, but the natives really do drive the Romans hard.
Okay, so Next question is from Andrew Boyce, who's a Roman fiction author. He's asking, what happened 80 years later?
Well, hi Andrew. Andrew's one of my friends on Twitter. 80 years later, you move on to the period when Constantius Chlorus, who is the Caesar, later Augustus in the west, is campaigning in the far north. So you're looking at post the Carausian revolt period towards the end of the century, when Constantius Chlorus is campaigning in the far north. This is, of course, the period when Constantine the Great famously hot-foots it from Thessalonica, being pursued by the emperor there to join his father, and later gets declared the emperor. It all goes back to York there, of course. It goes back to Constantine being declared emperor in York in AD 306. So it's the time when Constantius Chlorus is campaigning at the very end of the century in the far north.
We've got a question that follows on from that then, really, Simon, from Roger, who asks, what long-term impact on York did Severus staying there for 3 years have?
Great question again. My interpretation is that if you have, so York is the furthest north. People who live in Corbridge might disagree, but I would argue that York is the furthest north significant Roman town or city of the empire. But even then, until, and again, this is only my opinion, it would not be as significant in scale as, for example, Londinium to the south, the provincial capital of the province of Britannia. But if you have the emperor living there for 3 years, and it's interesting, it's a great question actually. When Severus is campaigning in the north of Caracalla in 209, Julia Domna and Geta are left in York, and they effectively run the empire. So that's going to have a huge impact on any town or city. Look at the impact that Severus had on his own Lepsis Magna, and he was only there for 8 months. He's in York for 3 years. So clearly, in terms of scale, imagine all the merchants in York gathering to service this 50,000 strong army. So it must have had a huge impact on York, which probably would have had a long-term impact, yes.
Brilliant. And Hilary asked if, Hilary says, Severus also developed Portus, didn't he? Did he leave a legacy on the Danube?
He only left well, you've got to bear in mind where you are on the Danube. This is immediately after sort of like 20 years worth of conflict. If you've seen Gladiator, the battle at the beginning with Marcus Aurelius and Russell Crowe, this is the final defeat, allegedly, of the Marcomanni, the German tribes who were fighting with their allies against the Romans in the Marcomannic Wars. That's a very sanguinous conflict. You know, it went on for about 20 years. You end up for the first time with what the Romans would have called barbarians penetrating to the far north of Italy. However, the Roman legacy of those wars was probably still in place by the time Severus was there. So my instincts are that Severus didn't really leave a big legacy on the Danube. I think he inherited the legacy of Marcus Aurelius and Commodus.
Brilliant. And Simon asks, how did the main body of force cross to Britain and where did it land?
Another great question. I mean, if you've got the vexallations of legionaries and the auxilia coming from the Rhine frontier, they would have probably crossed straight across the North Sea to go to Bruff-on-Humber, which was effectively it's not only the Civitates capital of the Parisii, but it was also effectively the Roman port for York. So you could go to Bruff-on-Humber and then go straight through to York. Or you could go to the Great Estuary in the middle of, now doesn't exist, but the Great Estuary in the middle of East Anglia, where you would go to Caestus and Tedmans, so Venter Icenorum, the Civitates capital of the Iceni, and again you then follow the line of Ermin Street going north to York. But again, I think Severus personally would have almost certainly have landed in Richborough on the east coast of Kent, because that's where the Imperial Gateway was built, the Monumental Arch by Domitian, after Agricola's alleged conquest of the north. This is allegedly the arch where all the Roman governors of Britain to that date would have gone through to proclaim themselves the governor of Britain. So therefore, Severus, being the emperor, arriving in his province. Very few Roman emperors came to Britain, remember, as emperor. I think only 4. Severus would almost certainly have made a point of going through that monumental arch at Richborough. So his route would have been specifically through Richborough, along Watling Street, across the River Medway at Rochester, to Southwark, and then across London Bridge to Londinium, where he would have stayed a while, not too long, and then he would have headed directly north along Ermey Street, eventually arriving in York.
Wow, brilliant. And Dylan asks, were the inhabitants of Scotland at this time Picts or Gaels, or were they ethnically, culturally similar to the Britons in the rest of Britain? And says, thanks very much for an excellent and informative presentation.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and thank you so much for listening. That goes for everybody who's listened, by the way. That's a great question. So I think the Picts come later, and I think at this time, not much later, by the way, but the Picts come later, and I think at this time, probably, certainly the Maeatae and probably the Caledonians have an awful lot in common with the Brigantes in the north of the province of Britain. So I think they probably have an awful lot in common with the Britons in the conquered north of Britain below Hadrian's Wall.
Great. And in a similar vein, Nigel asked a question about Septimus. You talked about his origins at the beginning and how kind of he was the peak of his family's kind of rise to power by becoming emperor. Was there snobbery around kind of his background and where he came from, and kind of not being born and bred in Rome?
Almost certainly. I mean, he spoke, allegedly he spoke in a North African accent. So we have no direct references to it from the contemporary sources I've come across, but I mean, almost certainly. But he didn't care. That's the thing to remember about this man. If you set aside the negative aspects of him, for example, the genocide in Scotland, but look at him as a personality, he was clearly exceptionally driven and had a huge amount of self-belief, and the manner in which he became the emperor, having the strength of character, as the Romans would have seen it, to march down with a legion followed by a couple more, but initially only one legion, down to the Forum Romanum in Rome, and then force the Senate to acknowledge him as emperor at the point of a sword, knowing the level of jeopardy involved if he got it wrong. This is a man with a great sense of self-belief, which from that point he then displays throughout his entire career. So whether there was snobbery against him or not, I just don't think he cared. He's also a great family man as well. Clearly really loved his wife, Julia Domna, who he would have thought of, I think, as his equal intellectually, and certainly loved his sons Caracalla and Geta to the extent where he turned a blind eye to the fact that his eldest son was becoming psychotic.
It's a very, very, very sad end to the story, isn't it?
It is. That's why it's this bizarre story arc that this character is born into the richest family in the richest city in North Africa, in the heat of a North African spring, dies in the freezing cold of winter, riddled with gout in York.
It's yeah, sad end. We've got some more questions, Simon. Are you happy to answer a few more?
Go for it. I'm very grateful for all the questions. Please keep them coming.
Excellent. So we've got one from Mike here who asks, he says, I've read the Ottadini, Votadini were allies of Rome, but you described an aggressive move through the borders. Was any alliance later, or is that just incorrect?
It depends. I mean, all we can do is base our interpretation on what the primary sources tell us, and the archaeology, but principally the primary sources. And from the very, very late AD 180s, the primary sources talk of the Maeatae and the Caledonians. We don't know how the native Britons would have styled themselves. We only know what the Romans called them. And from this point, they talk of these two huge confederations. By default, however, confederations comprised tribes. So you may well have had these cultural entities still existing, but we have no sight of them because the Roman contemporary writers choose to overlook them, probably to big up the Roman military campaign, actually, to show how big their opponents were, even though we know from the actual narrative when we examine it that actually it was a very asymmetrical conflict.
Brilliant, thank you. And then the next one is about the graves of the soldiers. What happened to them, and does the archaeology reflect the number of deaths? And that's a question from Ricardo.
Ricardo, great question. In actual fact, we don't know. A very interesting point here is actually there are very few references in epigraphy of tombstones to Severus's time in Britain. Now, if you look at the Flavian campaigns in Britain of Agricola and the early warrior governors of that period, so for example, Sir Elialis and Frontinus, we have quite a lot of epigraphy giving names of Roman soldiers who fought in those campaigns where they're buried. With this campaign, though, we don't. Now, the Romans would certainly have tried to have removed the bodies of their buried south if they could, but given it was a very brutal campaign, you may well find that a lot of these Roman soldiers who were killed, as with the natives, were just buried where they fell because the Romans couldn't do anything other than that, apart from give them their funeral rites.
Sure, and I guess so. Simon had asked a question as well about the evidence to show sort of the guerrilla actions that happens, and I suppose it's similar answer, really, isn't it? That it's very difficult to show that.
It is, although one of the things we use as archaeologists and historians is analogy, looking at how things happen elsewhere at a different time, which we can almost certainly say happened here. And John Reed of the Tremontium Trust actually wrote a great paper about his research at the Roman siege at the hill forts, which is earlier, at Burns Walk. And there we can actually see through the archaeological record the way the Romans stormed these hill forts. And this is how Severus's troops would have stormed the local hill forts, where the natives would have coalesced to try and defend themselves from this massive surge through the borders. And there they found thousands and thousands of slingshots. Now remember, a lead slingshot is like a low velocity bullet. It's also more powerful in terms of siege conflict than an arrow, because it doesn't need to penetrate your armor or you to cause serious damage. If you're wearing a helmet or not and you get hit on the head with a slingshot, it's going to incapacitate you if it doesn't kill you. And we find at this hill fort at Burns Walk, through the work of the Tremontium Trust and others, thousands of these slingshots along the parapets. So clearly the auxiliaries were using bombardments of slingshots and ballista to keep the heads down of the defenders while they cleared out the gateways using the leaders in probably testudo formation to force the gateway of the hill fort and then commit a massacre inside. So through that analogy, we can get some real insight into probably what would have happened with Severus in his campaign.
Brilliant, that's great. And someone's asked if there's any evidence of monumentalism in Scotland that Severus used to mark his campaign in the same way he did elsewhere.
No, there isn't. The direct answer is no, there isn't. Now, you could. I do make the case actually when I'm giving a talk on the Severn campaigns. If Severus had lived and the Romans had stayed in Scotland for longer, certainly in parts of modern Scotland for longer, certainly in parts of modern Scotland, you may have started seeing stone-built environments taking place, which you see south of Hadrian's Wall, and then you might have seen monumentalism. But of course, Severus dies. Caracalla and Geta aren't interested. The Romans drift away, and the story takes a very different direction from the one that Severus had in mind when he mounted this ridiculously large campaign.
Brilliant. And you've had a shout out from Rob at the Tremontium Trust here, Simon, just to say thanks for your support and knowledge of all things Roman across the Scottish borders and beyond.
Rob and everybody from the Tremontium Trust in the Scottish borders, it's my pleasure. I love the work you do. It's great.
Brilliant. And then Philip is asking, were the Brigantes pacified or bought off? Were the Romans in danger of leaving rebellion at their rear?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. That's a big question, that is. If you go to my narrative, in fact, actually, I'm writing another book at the moment, Claire, which you won't be surprised about, called Roman Conquest Britannia, which tells the story of all the Roman conquest campaigns in Britain, including Severus, which I'm writing as we speak, actually, which is hopefully why I'm quite on point. But if you were to look, for example, at the Agricolan campaigns in the late 1st century AD, Agricola's first year of campaigning was against the Brigantes, allegedly, whom the Romans had already conquered. And you could make a case that the trouble in the north of Britain around the time of the accession of Hadrian was again something to do with the Brigantes. Now remember, the far north of Britain, I argue, although it's part of a province, sorry, the north of Britain below the Hadrian's Wall is part of the province. The north and the west is this military frontier zone where the entire economy is bent towards maintaining the Roman military presence. So you could make the case that the Brigantes, who are the inhabitants of much of this area, were always under the cosh. And you could make a case, I can't tell you definitively, but you could make a case that they were always a cause of trouble just because of the fact they were economically being utilised to support the Roman military.
Brilliant. We've got a couple more questions about camps here. So if I do these two together, so we've got one from Pauline asking, were previous marching camps maintained as the main force moved on to the next? And then we've got another question from Sharon, who's asking about Burnswalk specifically, and she's saying that she thought the latest research suggested that the fort was abandoned by the time the Romans got there, and it was a practice site.
Okay, so the first question is, in my opinion, the Roman marching camps which marched up the Highland boundary fault actually then became, by the time Caracalla got to Stonehaven, so you see the Highland line merging with the sea, I think they became the Glenblocker forts, because why wouldn't you? Because you've had this enormous commitment to build these marching camps in the first place. They're there to seal off the glens to prevent the natives there escaping into the Highlands and any reinforcements from the Highlands getting into the lowlands. So I think that's definitely the case. In terms of Burnswalk, I think at the moment the theory is, this is only my opinion, but the theory is there was an earlier opinion that there may have been practice camps, but the most recent research shows that they're actually full-fat Roman assaults.
Brilliant. We've got a question from Alan, who says, you mentioned the testudo formation. Would this work using round shields?
So it's a really good question. I mean, if you look at the Roman military of the Dominate period of empire, so this is after Diocletian, this is the later Roman Empire, so this is when you have the round and oval shields. The Roman military are still described as forming defensive formations with those shields. So to answer your question directly, yes, but possibly less well.
Brilliant. And then there's a really good question here from G. Griffin, who was there any oral tradition handed down in the British tribes that survived into folklore?
That's a fantastic question. In my research, I've not found it. But it doesn't mean it's not there. But in my research, I've not found it. But let's remember, if the recent archaeological activity is correct and there was depopulation, there aren't going to be that many people around to actually remember things orally in the first place.
That is true. Good point. Now, this is a good question, I think, Simon. This is from Alistair. He says, sorry, another one. He doesn't get a chance to ask an expert very often, so fair play to him. He's making the most of it. He says, Dio says the Maeatae lived close to the wall. Which wall do you favour? Personally, he thinks the Antonine had been forgotten.
No, I don't. I personally think it's the Antonine Wall. I think you've got I think broadly the Maeatae are going to be in the Scottish borders and north of the Antonine Wall, and then going to the Upper Midland Valley and into the Highlands, you have the Caledonians.
Brilliant. And we have. Do you want to do? It's just gone 9:30, Simon. Would you like to answer a couple more, or?
I'll do 3 more.
3 more. Brilliant. That is fab. Thank you so much. So, what have we got? We've got a question from Andrew asking, considering the success of the Roman Empire, do you think that repeated failures to control the north of Scotland would have confused and frustrated the emperors?
Again, that's a really great question. In my opinion, through to the advent of the Picts, this is only my opinion, I think the Romans would only have committed the military capability and cost to try and conquer the far north of Britain for political gain, if there was the imperial will, and that often wasn't the case. Now, this did change later in the empire when you have the arrival of the Picts, in my opinion, but by that time the Romans weren't in a position to try it again. So certainly earlier, it was only when there was a political will, there was a desire for martial valor. So with the Flavians, for example, this is the new dynasty with with Vespasian and with Titus and with Domitian, they wanted martial glory to show their new dynasty in a positive light, and they chose to the place in the empire where they could get it, which is in the far north of Britain. And then you have Severus, again, wanting to campaign in the far north. And it's no surprise that when we have the campaign in the 2nd century, it's around the time of the advent of a new emperor, who may choose Britain because it's a place they can guarantee having a fight. Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. But it's only on those occasions, not all the time.
Interesting. That's great. We've got a question from Adrian, who's asking, is there any evidence, archaeological evidence for attacks on the Severn forts, and are any more excavations of the forts planned?
Research is always ongoing in Scotland on the various marching camp fort sites, etc. So that's almost never ending, even if it's only at one site or another site. That's never ending. I've personally not come across recently any research which shows direct evidence of the camps being assaulted, but certainly in the contemporary historical record, the primary sources do talk of the natives in the far north eventually attacking the camps and the forts because they've got no other way of engaging the Romans. Brilliant.
And then our last question, and thank you so much for answering all these questions, Simon. It's a monumental effort. We have done well over 40 questions here, so it's really great. Yes. And so the final question is from Dylan, who says, you mentioned the British auxiliaries. Are there any records to suggest where these were drawn from? Yeah, I mean, we know the names of most of the auxiliary units in Britain around this time, just because of the various pieces of epigraphy, etc. And usually with the auxiliaries, they weren't drawn from the native country, largely to make sure that they didn't misbehave within their own population. So you have auxiliaries in Britain from Dalmatia, from Batavia in the Rhine Delta, from Gaul, from Spain. Wow, that's a huge range, isn't it? It's incredible. Not sure how they'd have felt if they came from central Spain, being on the Gascon Ridge in the middle of winter. A bit chilly, I suspect. Yes. Brilliant. Well, as I say, thank you so much, Simon. I'm sure if we were in a room together, as opposed to doing this digitally, there'd be huge applause at the moment as everyone shares their thanks with you for being here tonight and for sharing your time with us. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. Good night, everybody.